Could you just explain through an example, maybe a children's party, what complexity really means?
Okay, so let's look at two things, all right? So sense making is defined as how do I make sense of the world so I can act in it. And with that, there's a key concept, which is different types of system exist in the world and you have to behave differently. So in nature, there are three types of system: ordered systems, complex systems, and chaotic systems. And critically, there are phase shifts between these. It's rather like latent heat. You boil water up to 100 degrees, but you've got to put more energy in to achieve the transition to steam. So the boundaries between these involve energy input or energy output, yeah? And something is definitely one or the other. So an ordered system has a very high level of constraint, so behavior is predictable. A chaotic system has no effective constraints, so it's effectively random. And a complex system, everything is entangled with everything else, so you get no repetition, you get high levels of uncertainty, but you do get patterns, and you can respond to the patterns. So one way to explain that is to think about a party for a bunch of 9-year-old kids and assume that you're holding it in your own house. This, by the way, is a mistake. Most adults realize the value of community centres because they have fire hoses. Fire hoses are useful for cleaning up after the party, and they're occasionally necessary for crowd control during the party itself. So what I would want to do is look at the party from the three systems perspectives. So if we assume the system is chaotic, it means the children's behavior is random, there are no controls, there are no constraints. That means they'll go on a personal experience of self-discovery, and your house will probably burn down in the process. Yeah? I've got a friend in California who tried this once. He'd just been to Burning Man. He believed in spontaneous self-organization. And he discovered with 9-year-olds that means spontaneous combustion. All right? So I don't recommend it, but it's an approach. The ordered approach, on the other hand, is taught by most good management consultants. Under this, it's of critical importance to agree the learning objectives for the party in advance of the party itself. The learning objectives should be aligned with the mission statement for education in the society to which you belong, and they should be clearly articulated and printed off on motivational posters with pictures of eagles soaring over valleys and water dropping into ponds, and placed around the room where you're holding the party. As the children come into the party, you give them Disney playing cards with the party value statement printed on the back of it. And of course, you've got a project plan for the party. The project plan has clear milestones throughout the party against which you can measure progress against ideal party outcome. And the senior adult starts the party with a motivational DVD. You don't want the children wasting time in play which isn't aligned with the learning objectives. Then they use PowerPoint to demonstrate their personal commitment to the party objectives and show the children how their allowances are linked to the achievement of the milestone targets. At the end of what will almost certainly be a highly successful party, you conduct an after-action review, update your best practice database on party management, and mandate future process improvements. If at this stage, for any remote reason, the children aren't happy, then you hire an appreciative inquiry practitioner or a happiness consultant, and they'll get them to tell happy stories, so they have happy mental models, and suitably indoctrinated, they'll like whatever you put in front of them next time. Yeah? So that's the ordered approach. Yeah? You've probably all tried this. The complex systems approach, on the other hand, is much simpler, and excuse one swear word here, but it's necessary. We start off by drawing a line in the sand, which is known as a constraint in complexity theory, a boundary constraint. We look the children squarely in the eye, and we say, cross that, you little bastards, and you die. And the value from an adult is you learn for flexible, negotiable boundaries, because rigid boundaries have a habit of breaking when you least expect it. We then throw in what are called catalytic probes, a football, a barbecue, a computer game, and hope a pattern of play will form, which is called an attractor. And attractors can be catalyzed, but they can't be created. If it's a beneficial attractor, you push more children towards it, you give it more energy. If it's a negative attractor, well, that's where you use the fire hoses. Yeah? So what we actually do is we manage the emergence of beneficial coherence within attractors, within boundaries. And that sequence is important. And we manage the only things we can manage in a complex adaptive system: the constraints, the catalysts, and the energy allocation. Anything else is a complete waste of time.
I can certainly relate to that. I have a 6-year-old and we don't have children's party in our home. We have talked a lot about, that the current global environment is constantly shifting. We sense more complexity. What do you think, what are the top 2 or 3 main drivers that are actually producing this?
Complexity is modulated, it's not driven. Driver language is cause and effect language. What complexity has is things which modulate behavior. So it's rather like a set of magnets, yeah? And if the magnets can change in strength and polarity, and then they influence what's happening in between. I think there are several things. Population growth is one. If you look at global warming, the ecological conditions combined with population warming. And the scary thing is we've got what actually happens normally with humans faced with a crisis that they don't understand. They lapse back to populism. So we've got the growth of populism. And one of my problems is I spent too much time studying the Weimar Republic, and the parallelism now is huge, right? But I think complexity also gives us one of the ways we can think about changing this, because you need to change what modulators have what influence. Yeah, you can't change the system, but you can change the modulators. And for example, one of the projects we've worked on now in Sweden, in Wales, in Colombia, in Singapore, is to get children to act as ethnographers to their own communities every month. Because if we get children to do that, we create narrative databases which are radically different from the internet and which can't be manipulated by algorithms or evil guys. Yeah? And you're also engaging the next generation in defining the future state, which has a big influence on adults. So there are initiatives which we and other people are running to try and change the dispositional state. But as long as people think it's got a cause and effect relationship, we won't get there. And as long as scientists keep talking about how terrible the problem is, more people will retreat. The human response to a problem you can't deal with is to pretend it doesn't exist. Yeah, we did a big project last year on plastic waste at festivals. By getting people to solve little problems, you change their awareness so they're prepared to do different things for the big problem. And the same is the problem with populists. I have to read Trump's tweets every morning, all right, for a project I'm working on. Trump doesn't argue anything, he uses key words which basically trigger what's called a trope or an assemblage or a strange attractor, a pattern of multiple narratives which make people feel comfortable. And every time somebody attacks him from the left, they use the same words, so they trigger the same attractors, so they're making the problem not worse. So once you know the science of this stuff, you can start to do things, but very few people know the science.
You mentioned President Trump, and you have worked with some very interesting people, amongst Steve Jobs and others. Do you think that they are sensing the world differently? Are they born with it, or is it a trainable skill that everyone can learn?
I had a pile of books thrown at me by Steve Jobs once. That was my one encounter. I think they see the world differently. I think they're naturally, well, not Trump, all right? Trump is what the Scots call canny. He's not intelligent, but he's cunning. Yeah, and that's actually quite scary because Hitler was in the same category. And he's not the same as Hitler, but what happens is populists get surrounded by people who exploit their laziness. And that's when it gets really scary. We're seeing the same in the UK at the moment with the people around Johnson. So I think there are some people, and the populists they kind of like make things work. They're at a point in time, and then other people surround them, and it kind of like becomes bad. Other people like Jobs just see the world differently from other people, from whatever their background is. And to give an illustration, I had a big argument in the UK a few years ago. I said we should, because when I went to university, it was free. Yeah, fees were paid, you got an allowance, but only 5% of the population went. But then for 3 years, you could just learn. You didn't have to worry about a living. You knew you were going to get a job. So I said what we should do is basically say you leave school at 18. If you're prepared to do national service, which can mean the army, and I'm arguing this from the left, by the way, not the right, so it would have undermined the right. Basically, you can go into the army or you can go and work for CAFAD or Oxfam overseas, but if you show that for 2 years you'll put your effort into something for the good of people other than yourselves, we'll pay for your university education. And I said, that means we'll get people into university in a slightly more mature base, so they learn more and they've got more real world. But it also means people can't become Little Englanders because they've lived in other cultures at a key point of their formation. And I think we need to do far more of that. It's why I'm appalled at us Britain leaving the European Union. We need more intercultural connectivity rather than cultural isolation at the moment.
I see. Still at sense making, there was an interesting concept that you mentioned, weak signal detection at the lecture. Can you elaborate on that? You know, how can we get people?
Yeah, it was the work I did for DARPA. I mean, if you actually look at it, you spot signals when it's too late to do something, and they're often coming through. So the thing which drove us on DARPA is if you go back to Northern Ireland in the 70s, all right? There's a point where the Catholic population stopped trusting the army, and it literally happens overnight with Bloody Sunday. But the build-up was there. So I was working on peace and reconciliation. I was going to be a Jesuit then, all right? So I'm in the Falls Road, which is a Catholic area. I got bundled into an RUC Land Rover. So this is the police, this is the state. And asked which of my legs did I want shot first. Then they heard my voice and they realised I was a mainland Catholic, not a Northern Ireland Catholic or a filthy tague, as they were going to call me. And they threw me out of the Land Rover and my legs are intact. Now, if the provost had come around that night, I would have probably joined. Yeah? Unfortunately, they didn't, all right? But it was there for the grace of God. The intelligent middle-class people became terrorists because they gave up on the state. And now all of the signals were there, but the state didn't notice them. And the same is true once terrorists are prepared to negotiate, the state doesn't negotiate until it's too late. And we've done a lot of work on this in Latin America and elsewhere. So what we focused on for DARPA was how do you spot in the civilian population these micro stories or the street stories which indicate the thing is about to change. Yeah, and sort of post-Brexit, post-Trump, we've done a lot of work on that since. But the approach is based on abductive logic, not inductive logic. So just to explain that, deduction if A then B, induction all the cases of A have B, so it's likely to be a causal link. Abduction, what's the most plausible connection between unconnected things? And the big problem on abduction is how is your intuitive leap more accurate than my intuitive leap? Because if you look at the build-up, say, to Pearl Harbor, which we studied, or Cuba, the sheer volume of weak signals is huge, the same in 9/11. There's so many people reporting things. After the event, we can see what we should have spotted, we didn't spot it at the time. Yeah? So what we focused on was developing visualizations which capture those micro stories and present them to decision makers so they see people who are thinking differently before they get conformed. And that's carried on since.
It seems that a lot of emergence goes into actually making decisions and creating the leader's intent. How important is leader's intent, in your opinion, in design?
I think there's several things on this. One is the issue about how do you do commander's intent, and that's a separate process. All right, so let me deal with two things. So one is that no leader makes a decision in isolation because leaders are surrounded by people who match their cognitive lacks. Most good leaders take people with them who are good at things a leader aren't. So a leader takes place in a political context. And I've said this to a lot of people in the military and also in companies. You have to realize that a leader may agree with you and they know you're saying the right thing, but it's not politically possible for them to do it. So they've got to say no. And the minute you become a 3-star, you've got to be political. Yeah? So you've got to feed data in the right way. So we need to understand the context in which a leader makes a decision. It's not a rational process. Yeah? The other way is the sort of work we've done on commander's intent, where we use metaphor. So for example, I can take Gettysburg, which every American officer knows about, as a key battlefield on day 2, where if it had gone the other way, Gettysburg would have gone to the south and the whole history of America would have been radically different. It's like one 10-minute period. And it's a guy called Chamberlain who fought the main defence action on Little Round Top. So if you say Little Round Top, no Chamberlain, I'm talking about a complex, very detailed understanding, but I've introduced a counterfactual. So in 3 words, I can convey something I couldn't convey in 15 pages. And that actually matches in with the way human language evolved. It evolved from abstractions, not from naming things. So there's things you can do to create much more sophisticated expressions of intent which allow you to delegate more effectively in the field.
That rhymes very well with the. I've written 3 quotes that you have mentioned during the lecture, and one was that creativity is not about the individuals; it's about interactions between the individuals. So, what are the most common mistakes leaders do you think make when they're dealing with complexity?
One is they focus on the individuals, not linkages. All right. I mean, and the trouble is, for the last 30 years, we've had this obsession. It comes from the engineering metaphor of organizations, so the assumption that human beings are widgets within the system. And it was quite interesting. I taught leadership with Peter Drucker, which was a great privilege. Yeah? And we came to the conclusion at the end that scientific management and complexity thinking had a lot in common, and they were both opposed to systems thinking. Because in scientific management, they automated manufacturing processes, but they had apprentice models of leadership. Because you could never run a company unless you'd worked in it for some time. And from a cognitive complexity point of view, we're bringing that back in. We're saying there's things we can automate, but it takes 2 or 3 years for the human brain and body to co-evolve around key knowledge assets. And at the moment, we're not doing that. And there, for example, the military concepts of crews, which have never been abandoned, are really important. Yeah, same in operating theatres. So you train people in role and role expectation, then the individual doesn't matter because they're occupying the role. And final illustration on this, I mean, my children are now 31 and 29, and one of them is writing critical essays about my inability to understand Deleuzian epistemology and is working for me, all right? So they grow up. But when they were teenagers, the things you most worry about, who are their friends? Because it's not what they innately were born with, it's who they interact with during key periods in their development. So interaction is the key. And by the way, it's more ethical to change interactions than to try and change people.
And it's much harder as well, I bet.
You can't change people.
There are certain trends like biological warfare, AI, the nuclear war, and all these trends that are terrifying people. What would be your message to these people?
And we did a very scary future state thing on the top of Powder Mountain in Utah in tents. I mean, only Californians would organise that. When I did it in Singapore, it was in Raffles Hotel, which is much nicer. I think in the existential threat, we said the first is still nuclear war. And the scariness is, the evidence is, at least some people want to use neutron bombs, and that's a genocide weapon. And that sort of desire to bomb, it's scary, and drones are scary because the ethical implications of drones are huge. It's no coincidence most science fiction goes back to swords, because the principle is if you kill somebody with a sword, you know what you're doing. If you kill somebody on a video screen, the ethics isn't present, right, in that sense. Second one is gene splicing. I can actually now buy a kit for a couple of $1,000s, and I can change gene structures on my kitchen table if I know what I'm doing. And that's really scary. Then there's AI. Because at the moment, artificial intelligence doesn't work like human intelligence, it's a swarm intelligence. And swarm intelligences can't be negotiated with. Yeah? And the fourth was global warming. And that's what's scary. But I think, I've often said this, we never lived in a fact-based society. What used to happen after the Second World War is people delegated decision-making to experts, and that really didn't work very well. So now they're trying populists for a change, right? So people always delegate authority. The issue is what is the social context in which people act? And that's why we're doing the children with grandparents, children's ethnographers. You've got to change the small things at the ground level for the big things to be possible.
Sweet. Well, my take on that one is that we really need to embrace complexity instead of fighting it in a way. What would be the kind of new techniques that you think? What sort of areas and expertise, sciences would you bring in, and how would you teach someone to?
Complexity is evolving, all right? So we've got different schools. I mean, the school I lead is anthro-complexity. And that basically fuses complexity science with cognitive neuroscience, with the biological end of anthropology and some philosophy. Yeah? But it says human beings aren't ants. Then you've got the modelers, and they kind of like believe human beings are ants. You've got the deterministic chaos guys. You've got the complexity is only a metaphor, the postmodernists. Yeah? So I think that means it's starting to mature. Yeah? I think once you really understand complexity, you don't say everything is complex. So a lot of people are trying to do that. You say human beings have learned to create order, and that's valuable, and that's what the Cynefin framework does. So a key distinction is, have we managed to create sufficiently stable constraints that we got predictive practice, in which case we can use best or good practice? Or is it truly complex, in which we move into parallel safe-to-fail experiments, we use cognitively diverse trios, we build social networks. There's a whole body of methods and tools developed for this. But it's not that you throw away what you're doing at the moment. You realise it's valid within boundaries, and you do different things on the other side of the boundary. So there's a whole body of stuff, right? The distributed ethnography, distributed decision-making, the work we're doing on acceptive innovation, where you link unarticulated needs with existing capabilities. It's not that the tools aren't there, it's just people are stuck in sort of old ways of thinking.
I see. I would like to finish off with two other quotes that I really liked at your lecture. One was that cognitive stress creates innovation. Could you just elaborate on that one a little bit?
Yeah, I have a deep... there's a real problem, all right, in that people who are creatives think that if everybody else was creative, the world would be a better place. It's like people who are engineers think if everybody else was an engineer, it would be a better place. And innovation gets stuck with this. So, you get actors who want people to do improv acting. You get artists who want them to draw pictures. Yeah? And the reality is people feel uncomfortable and embarrassed by that. I mean, I use actors, but people coach an actor. Yeah, or I use artists to draw things. I don't get people to draw things, all right? So the combination is quite good. But that creativity school, I think, is quite dangerous, yeah? Because they're not realizing that if people are comfortable, they don't think differently. So it's called autonomic v novelty receptive processing. There's an economist who called it thinking fast and thinking slow. But the biology is a better place to go on this because he's just got a correlation. So autonomic processing is what you do most of the time. You just do and your brain fires after you've done something just to check if the reaction works. So as long as you get no negative impulse, you just carry on doing things the way you're doing them. Only when that doesn't work do you start to go into novelty receptive process and you think deeper. But that takes a lot of energy, and evolution is about energy reduction. Yeah? It's like cognitive biases aren't cognitive biases, they're cognitive heuristics. This is Klein's concept, because they reduce the energy cost of human decision making, so they're not going to go away. So you need to work with that, right? And in order for people to innovate, the existing ways of doing things have got to become impossible. And that's not done through imagination in workshops. It's done by putting people in environments where you have a high level of stress, but you throw them into a combination where they can see things from a different perspective. So we've done things, for example, like taking people away for a week and throwing them together with scientists from multiple backgrounds and getting them to redefine their problems and interact with the scientists so they come up with novel solutions. And the scientists have never worked in industry, and that's deliberate. So their expertise can't be challenged, but they've got no presuppositions. Yeah, we've done stuff in stress-based work, right, where you put teams under very tight time pressure. Yeah, you have a safety net, but they're under tight time pressures, then they innovate. Yeah. So starvation, pressure, perspective shift are the three key conditions for innovation.
And I would bet, that if you go through that, all that, it takes up a lot of energy, as you mentioned. They're making the mistake of not providing time to regenerate, because if you need to leave some time to recuperate after that, right?
Yes and no. I mean, generally the workshop facilitators, yes, partly because when we facilitate something, we don't go on the floor. There's a massive problem with people who facilitate workshops, and people look to the facilitator and they follow the cultural expectations of the facilitator. We're seeing this with government labs, yeah? Massive criticism from anthropology. So yeah, I mean, I've run sessions with thousands of people in the hall, but I've been on the balcony. I never go on the floor. I direct it indirectly. And that's stressful, all right? But you can do very small things as a leader and this is what the concept we did on trios. So for example, on software design now, we put a naive, young, very fast programmer, very bright, can build prototypes, together with a systems architect or a tester, with a user trained to talk to IT people, which is easier than the other way around. And we throw 15 trios at a problem for a week and see what they come up with. That's actually very effective, because they're working with people they don't understand. That creates cognitive load, but the system finds diversity. So actually, once you get complexity, you reduce costs substantially.
You see, the last quote that I have from you is, we need not just people who read recipe books, but we need chefs. How do you explain the practice and theory together?
I think Aristotle called it Sophia and Pronesis. Yeah? You have to have practical wisdom and theoretical wisdom. So, I mean, I used recipe books when I went to university for the first time, right? I mean, there were some things I could cook because my grandmother would kill me if I didn't cook them properly, but I needed to diversify, right? But now I've got about 200 recipe books in the kitchen, and I don't think I ever use them except for initial ideas, because I now know enough about the theory of cooking and I've got enough practice, right? So a chef has served an apprenticeship, so they know how to do things without thinking about it. Their body and brain have co-evolved. But they also know the theory of taste, so they can handle uncertainty. So if you bring a recipe book user into your kitchen and you haven't got all the right ingredients and all the right equipment, they're lost. A chef will adjust to what you've got there. And at the moment, we're focused on, the big consultancies drive industrial recipes when we desperately need apprentice-based learning.